3 soft scratches broke the winter silence at a Navy SEAL's back door. Outside stood a mother German shepherd, snow clinging to her black and tan coat, with 2 tiny puppies pressed beneath her for warmth. Jason Miller gave them food and opened the door, but the mother refused to come inside. Instead, she walked toward the forest, stopped, and looked back at him. The next morning she returned and did the same thing again. Why would a mother dog leave warmth behind while her puppies were still so vulnerable? When the dog finally left both puppies at Jason's door and ran toward the trees alone, would he follow her? And what was she trying to lead him toward? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late February had settled hard over Ironwood, Michigan, covering the edges of the Upper Peninsula in old snow and new silence. The morning sky was a flat winter white, the kind that made the line between earth and clouds difficult to find, while spruce and pine stood dark beyond the backyard of the small, cedar-sided house. Jason Miller had been awake long enough for his coffee to turn lukewarm when 3 measured scratches came against the glass of the back door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Not frantic, not random, deliberate enough to make him stop reading the message on his phone. At 41, Jason was a tall, powerfully built American Navy SEAL, 6'2" with broad shoulders that made the old kitchen chairs look undersized beneath him, a lean waist, and the balanced strength of a man who had spent most of his adult life treating physical readiness as a form of survival. His dark brown hair was cut close, in the military fashion he had never bothered to change, though silver had begun appearing at both temples. A neatly trimmed beard sharpened an already angular face, and a faint, pale line beneath his right jaw remained from an incident he rarely discussed. His eyes were gray-blue and habitually alert, the eyes of a man who entered rooms noticing exits before furniture. With strangers he was courteous without being easy, patient only when patience had a clear purpose. Years of service had taught him that hesitation could become somebody else's tragedy. They had not taught him what to do when there was no obvious enemy, no briefing, and no correct decision waiting to be identified. The message on his phone was another reminder of that problem. A position had opened in a training program for younger SEALs, less field work, more instruction. More responsibility for turning experience into judgment before younger men had to learn every lesson the expensive way. Everyone who mentioned the position called it an opportunity. Jason heard something else underneath the word: transition. He had not answered. 3 scratches sounded again. He set the phone face down and crossed the kitchen. The animal outside was not what he expected. A female German shepherd stood on the snow-covered back step, perhaps 4 years old, black and tan coat wet along the shoulders and dusted with white crystals. She was not starving, but she was too thin through the flanks, the strain of nursing visible beneath her heavy winter fur. One ear stood perfectly upright while the other carried a small, old tear near its outer edge. Her dark muzzle had begun collecting tiny beads of melted snow, and her brown eyes were steady rather than pleading. Beneath and slightly behind her crowded 2 German shepherd puppies, each around 7 weeks old. One was smaller, with a narrow little face, bright brown eyes and tan eyebrows that made the puppy look perpetually astonished. The second was heavier through the paws and chest, with a darker saddle and a cautious habit of keeping half the mother's body between itself and anything unfamiliar. Jason had seen frightened dogs before. He had seen aggressive ones. This was neither. The mother was evaluating him. "All right," he murmured, opening the door only halfway. Cold air entered immediately. The dog did not move. Jason crouched and held out an empty hand, palm low. Her head lowered. The muscles along her shoulders tightened. When he shifted his weight toward the puppies, she stepped sideways and placed herself directly between them and him. No bark, no lunge, just a low warning from deep in her chest. Jason stopped. The response irritated some old professional instinct in him. Not anger at the dog, but frustration at having his intentions rejected. People often imagined men like him survived because they were fearless. Jason knew better. They survived because they learned to interpret danger quickly and act before uncertainty grew teeth. Yet this animal was forcing him into uncertainty and refusing every shortcut. "Fine," he said. "Your rules." He went inside, found leftover roasted chicken, plain rice, and a shallow bowl of water, then set everything several feet from the doorway. He backed away before opening the door wider. The mother waited almost a full minute before approaching. She ate quickly, but not wildly, pausing every few bites to look at Jason. The smaller puppy ventured toward the rice. The larger followed reluctantly. When Jason reached for the water bowl to move it closer, the mother blocked him again. He withdrew his hand. It felt absurd that a German shepherd standing in his mother's backyard could make him feel as if he had failed a negotiation. After eating only part of the food, the mother surprised him. He left the puppies near the step and walked across the snowy yard toward the tree line. Jason remained in the doorway. 20 yards away, the dog stopped. She turned, looked directly at him, waited. He glanced at the puppies, then back at her. "You've got food here." The dog did not move. Jason understood animal behavior well enough not to build human stories around every glance. Dogs followed scent, habit, fear, hunger. They did not arrive carrying riddles for lonely Navy SEALs. After perhaps 15 seconds, she turned toward the forest again, walked several more steps, then looked back once more. Jason stayed where he was. Eventually she returned, checked both puppies carefully with her nose, and settled beside them. The strange sequence repeated that afternoon. 3 scratches at the glass after Jason had allowed them to shelter beneath the covered porch. A little food, a little water. Then the mother walked toward the woods, stopped, and watched him. Again, Jason refused to follow. This time, irritation gave way to curiosity. The repetition was too structured to dismiss easily. Still, he told himself there were dozens of explanations. Perhaps she had another food source. Perhaps she had been living in the woods. Perhaps she was simply unwilling to go farther while the puppies remained behind. But that last possibility bothered him. If the forest was her home, why bring the puppies to him first? As daylight faded, Jason sat alone at the kitchen table, while the 3 dogs rested just beyond the glass under the porch roof. His phone lay beside his hand, the training offer still unanswered. The old house seemed especially quiet in winter. He had returned there on leave because there were boxes to sort, repairs his late mother had postponed, and rooms filled with objects nobody else could decide whether to keep. He had expected grief to be loud. Instead, most days it behaved like dust, present on everything, visible only when the light struck from the right direction. Jason looked at the message again. Training younger men should have felt meaningful. He knew that intellectually. But another part of him heard the word training and translated it into replacement. A younger man taking the place he once occupied. A younger body moving faster. A younger face being sent where Jason had once been needed. He disliked that part of himself because it sounded vain, and vanity was difficult to admit when disguised as dedication. Outside, the mother dog raised her head and watched him through the window. Jason almost laughed. "You have your problem," he told her softly. "I have mine." She blinked once and lowered her head again. The next morning was colder. Fine snow moved sideways through the yard, too light to fall and too restless to settle. Jason had just started the coffee when the familiar sound came. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He opened the door, expecting the same ritual. The mother stood there with both puppies. But this time she behaved differently. She nudged the smaller puppy toward the threshold with her muzzle. When it resisted, she pushed again. The puppy stumbled inside, paws sliding on the kitchen floor. The larger puppy backed away, uncertain, until the mother pressed against its side and guided it forward too. Jason stood motionless. Both puppies were now inside the doorway. The mother remained outside. "Come on," Jason said quietly, stepping back to give her room. She did not enter. Instead, she looked at the puppies, then at Jason. Something in that look unsettled him. Not because he believed the animal was thinking like a person, but because her priorities were suddenly unmistakable. She had spent 2 days preventing him from coming too close to them. Now, she was deliberately leaving them within his reach. Jason crouched beside the puppies, the smaller one pressed against his boot for warmth. The larger stayed several inches away but did not retreat. The mother waited until Jason had taken an old wool blanket from a chair and placed it around them. Then she turned and ran. "Hey!" Jason followed onto the porch. She crossed the backyard without hesitation. At the edge of the trees, she stopped and looked back. Something flashed beneath her collar when she turned her head. Jason had noticed the worn leather before, but not what hung beneath it. He stepped through the snow toward her carefully. For once, she allowed him close enough to examine it. Attached behind the weathered collar tag was a tiny brass key, darkened with age. Beside it hung a thin metal identification plate, its lettering almost erased by years of wear. Jason brushed away the snow with one thumb. Most of the inscription was unreadable. 2 things remained clear. E. Brooks. The mother backed away from his hand. Then she trotted toward the forest, stopped beneath the dark pines and looked over her shoulder. Jason looked behind him at the 2 puppies sheltered inside the open doorway. Then he looked at the key in the dog's collar, at the name worn nearly smooth, and finally at the animal waiting where the yard ended and the forest began. For 2 days he had assumed she wanted food. Now, for the first time, Jason understood that she had been asking for something else. She wanted him to follow. By late morning, the snow over Ironwood had thinned to a dry, restless drift, and the sky remained the color of old pewter. Jason Miller stood at the edge of his backyard, watching the mother German shepherd wait beneath the pines. Every instinct trained into him said to move now, follow the trail before wind erased whatever remained of it. But 2 7-week-old puppies were huddled behind him in a kitchen that still smelled of coffee and wet fur. He had spent too many years learning that urgency and recklessness were not the same thing. The dog might know where she was going, but Jason did not. He had no map, no explanation, and no idea who E. Brooks was. So he did the thing he found least satisfying. He gathered information first. When the mother dog finally returned to check her puppies, Jason kept his distance and used his phone to photograph the battered identification plate hanging beneath her collar. The front was nearly smooth, but the reverse carried the faded number of a county rabies registration and the remains of a veterinary clinic stamp. Less than an hour later, Jason was standing inside Northwood's veterinary clinic with melting snow darkening the shoulders of his jacket. Dr. Melissa Grant, a 46-year-old veterinarian with curly auburn hair pulled into an untidy knot, pale, freckled skin, and the practical calm of someone accustomed to frightened animals and frightened owners behaving much the same way, studied the photograph on his phone. Melissa was short, broad through the shoulders, and moved with brisk efficiency, but there was nothing hurried in the way she listened. 15 years treating working dogs, farm dogs, and elderly pets had taught her that people often filled uncertainty with dramatic explanations. She preferred records. "Old tag," she said, adjusting thin rectangular glasses, "but not old enough to be useless." She entered the number into an archived county database, waited, then turned the monitor slightly toward Jason. The registered owner was Eleanor Brooks, 78 years old. The address was less than a mile from his mother's house. Melissa's expression changed when she saw the name. Eleanor was a community nurse for years. Half this town over 60 probably had her tell them to stop smoking at least once. "You know her?" Jason asked. "Enough to know she'd rather walk through a snowbank than admit she needed help." Melissa looked again at the photograph of the thin German shepherd. "And that dog belongs to her. Female, about 4 now. Had a litter recently, obviously." She hesitated. "If Eleanor isn't with her, I'd check on Eleanor before I worried about the dog." Jason drove straight there. The Brooks house sat on a narrow road where older homes gave way to woods. A modest one-story place with faded green siding, a low porch, and a bird feeder bending beneath accumulated snow. Nothing looked violently wrong. That was the unsettling part. There was no broken window, no open door, no dramatic sign announcing that a person had vanished. A dark blue Buick sat inside the detached garage, visible through a side window. Snow had built around the tires. The house itself was dark, despite the gray afternoon. A heavy limb had pulled down the service line near the back corner, leaving the building without power. Jason was examining the untouched front steps when the neighboring door opened. A woman in a purple parka stepped carefully across the packed snow. Diane Parker was 69. A retired pharmacy clerk with a round face, cropped white hair, and the direct curiosity of someone who had spent 40 years remembering other people's prescriptions, birthdays, divorces, and excuses. "You family?" she asked. "No, Jason Miller. I'm trying to find Eleanor Brooks." Diane's forehead creased. "I thought she was with her nephew. When did you last see her?" Diane looked toward the Brooks house. 2 days ago, maybe late morning. She had her red backpack. I remember because she told me not to shovel her walk, said she'd do it when she got back. Got back from where? Didn't say. Jason's attention sharpened. Was the dog with her? Diane nodded. The shepherd, yes, not the puppies. Eleanor worried cold air would get into the house if she left the back door open too long. She was fussing over them like they were newborn grandchildren. Jason took out his phone. Did anyone report her missing? Diane's face slowly lost color. Missing? I thought Mark knew where she was. Sheriff Tom Harris arrived 20 minutes later in a county SUV followed by a deputy. Tom was 55, tall but slightly stooped through the shoulders, with close-cut gray hair, a weathered rectangular face, and a brown mustache that belonged to an earlier decade, but suited him too well to replace. He had the deliberate temperament of a man who had learned that small-town emergencies were rarely improved by raising his voice. Years earlier, he had spent 14 hours coordinating a winter search that began as an old man probably visiting a friend and ended with the man found barely alive beside a frozen creek. Since then, Tom disliked assumptions almost as much as Jason did. 78. 2 days unseen, vehicle still here, temperature below freezing, he summarized. That's enough for me. He called the number registered for Eleanor's emergency contact. Mark Brooks arrived soon afterward, carrying the kind of guilt that had not yet decided whether to become fear or anger. Mark was 50, about 6 feet tall, heavy through the chest, with thinning dark blonde hair, a close-cropped beard streaked with gray, and deep lines around hazel eyes that suggested years of squinting at spreadsheets and sleeping too little. He managed a building supply company outside town and approached most problems as if they could be solved by replacing the defective part. He loved Eleanor, but love had become tangled with vigilance after finding her on her kitchen floor following a fall 3 years earlier. "She's supposed to be at Claire's," he said before anyone had finished explaining. "She told me after we argued that she'd stay with Claire for a couple days." Tom asked, "Did Claire confirm that?" Mark stopped. "No, I assumed." His jaw tightened. "Why wouldn't Claire call me?" Mark had an emergency key. Inside, the house was cold enough that their breath faintly showed. Nothing appeared disturbed. Eleanor's handbag sat on a chair. Her phone was plugged into a dead outlet beside the kitchen counter. The refrigerator was warming, and on the counter Jason found a bag of puppy food, feeding bottles, towels, and a handwritten schedule listing amounts for morning and evening meals. Whoever had left had expected to return. Near the back door stood a row of shoes, but one obvious space separated a pair of slippers from brown walking shoes. Mark confirmed Eleanor's insulated winter boots were missing. So was her red backpack. "She went somewhere on purpose," Jason said. Mark stared at the feeding schedule. "That doesn't make it better." "No," Jason replied. But it changes the question. Mark looked at him sharply. You don't know my aunt. That's true, Jason's answer came without defensiveness, which somehow irritated Mark more. She thinks asking for help is surrender, Mark said. Last month the furnace acted up and she sat here wearing 2 sweaters instead of calling me. Jason glanced around the cold room. His first reaction was immediate and familiar. Then she should not be living alone. Danger identified, remove danger, problem solved. He knew that kind of thinking. It had saved lives. It also made people very easy to reduce to problems. Claire Wilson arrived before Jason could say it aloud. At 72, Claire was tall and slender, with warm brown skin, silver-gray hair arranged in a loose, shoulder-length bob, and dark eyes made larger by round, tortoiseshell glasses. She had retired after 36 years as a public librarian and carried herself with the quietly dangerous confidence of a woman who knew where records were kept and how often confident men had failed to read them. A mustard-colored scarf was wrapped twice around her neck, and she removed it while Mark demanded, "Why didn't you tell me she wasn't with you?" Claire stared at him. "Because I thought she was with you. She said she was staying at your place. She told me you wanted her to stay with you for a few days, and she said she was considering it." Considering isn't going. Neither is saying she might stay with me. The silence after that was ugly because no one had actually lied. Each had simply heard the version that relieved them of worry. Claire's face softened first. "I called yesterday," she said. "It went to voicemail. I assumed she was still angry with me." Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "I called too, same thing." "And neither of you checked," Jason said before deciding whether the sentence needed saying. Mark turned toward him. "Easy for you to judge." Jason met his gaze. "I'm not judging." Yet privately he knew he had been. Human beings liked villains because villains simplified emergencies. A careless nephew, a stubborn elderly woman, an inattentive friend. But sometimes, disaster was built from ordinary assumptions made by people who loved one another. The search began around Eleanor's property and nearby roads, but darkness and increasing wind limited how far Tom was willing to send deputies without a clearer direction. Jason returned to his mother's house with the German Shepherd and her 2 puppies. For the first time, the mother crossed the threshold willingly, though she remained close to the door and watched him whenever he handled the puppies. Claire came with him after insisting she would rather be useful than sit beside her phone. Mark went with Sheriff Harris to contact hospitals, utility crews, and anyone who might have seen Eleanor. During the evening, Claire sat at Jason's kitchen table, wrapping one puppy in a towel, while the other slept against her boot. "Mark means well," she said. Jason poured coffee neither of them particularly wanted. "He thinks she shouldn't live alone." "And you?" Claire smiled faintly. "I think Eleanor should be allowed to dislike the available choices." Jason leaned against the counter. "If something is unsafe, pretending it isn't unsafe doesn't give someone freedom." "True," Claire looked at him over her glasses. "But removing every risk from a person's life can remove the life along with it." Jason thought of the training offer waiting unanswered on his phone. People around him were calling it safer, wiser, the sensible next step. He suddenly disliked how closely his thoughts about Eleanor resembled the thoughts he resented when they were applied to him. The mother German Shepherd rose without warning. Her ears turned toward the window. She left the puppies, crossed the kitchen, and stopped at the glass. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Jason and Claire looked at each other. He opened the door. The dog shot into the snow, crossed the yard, and stopped beneath the first line of pines. She looked back once. This time Jason did not debate what the gesture meant. He pulled on his winter jacket, packed a flashlight, emergency blanket, radio, water, and basic medical supplies. Then he called Sheriff Harris. "I'm following her," Jason said. "I'll keep my phone location active. I'll update you as long as I have signal." Tom was silent for a moment. "Don't turn this into a solo rescue operation." "I'm following a dog, Tom. That's already done enough damage to my dignity." Claire almost laughed despite herself. Jason crouched beside the puppies. "Can you stay with them?" Claire pulled off her glasses and looked at him as though the question were insulting. "Jason, I kept a public library alive through 3 budget cuts and a plumbing disaster. I can supervise 2 puppies." Outside, the mother dog had not moved. Jason stepped through the doorway and closed it behind him. At the edge of the forest, she turned and began walking. This time, Jason followed. The forest swallowed Jason Miller quickly. Within minutes, the warm rectangle of his mother's kitchen had disappeared behind spruce trunks and falling snow, and the only thing ahead of him was the mother German shepherd, moving through the white ground with an urgency that never quite became panic. The evening had not yet become full darkness, but February light in Michigan's Upper Peninsula faded early, leaving the woods washed in blue-gray shadow. Jason kept roughly 20 feet behind the dog, resisting the instinct to close the distance. She had accepted him enough to leave her puppies in his house, but trust was not a switch that had suddenly been turned on. Every few minutes she stopped, checked that he remained behind her, then continued. The route made little sense at first. She ignored a maintained snowmobile trail and instead followed a shallow depression between the trees, where young birches had grown through what once might have been a road. Jason noticed old signs beneath the snow. Squared drainage ditches, rusted wire wrapped around a cedar, a broken wooden marker half buried beside a stump. This had been a working road once, probably connected to the mining operations that had shaped much of the region before the forest reclaimed them. Walking became harder as the ground rose. Jason's boots sank above the ankles in places, and once he had to catch himself against a pine when crusted snow collapsed beneath his weight. The German shepherd moved more efficiently, placing her paws carefully, and sometimes disappearing behind low ridges before returning to make sure he had not stopped. Jason checked his phone whenever signal allowed. Sheriff Tom Harris had his location, and Jason sent short updates rather than explanations. Heading northwest, Old Service Road, dog still leading. The absurdity of those sentences was not lost on him. Years of military operations had trained him to communicate coordinates, conditions, threats, and objectives. Tonight his objective was apparently follow the dog. Somewhere in another life, one of his former teammates would have enjoyed that far too much. Nearly an hour after leaving the house, the German shepherd slowed. The trees opened onto a narrow clearing hidden beneath heavy spruce branches, and an old structure emerged from the snow as gradually as something being remembered. It was a small timber station, perhaps 20 feet long, built of dark weathered logs resting on a low stone foundation. One corner of the roof had sagged, and a stovepipe leaned at an angle above it. A faded metal sign remained nailed beside the doorway, but rust had eaten through most of the lettering. Jason could make out only fragments: iron and service. It looked like one of the small stations that had once supported mining crews, surveyors, or maintenance workers when the surrounding roads were still active. The mother dog went directly to the door. She sniffed along the threshold, scratched once at the bottom, then lifted one paw and struck near the old brass lock. Jason stared at her, then at the small key still hanging beneath her collar. "You've got to be kidding me." He approached slowly. The dog allowed him near but kept her head turned toward his hand. Jason detached the key without removing the collar. It was tarnished, unevenly worn, and looked far older than the dog carrying it. The lock resisted at first. Jason brushed ice from the keyway, tried again, and felt the mechanism turn with a dry, metallic click. He stopped for a second. People often talked about coincidences as though the word made them less unsettling. To Jason, coincidence simply meant there was an explanation he had not found yet. The air inside smelled of cold wood, dust, old iron, and something more recent, damp wool. Jason swept his flashlight across the room. A narrow table stood beneath one window. 2 mismatched chairs faced a blackened cast-iron stove. Shelves along the rear wall held rusted cans, a cracked enamel basin, and several warped books whose titles had faded away. Dust covered almost everything, but not evenly. Near the doorway were dark marks where snow had recently melted into the floorboards. Jason crouched. The edges were too soft to preserve a clear boot pattern, yet the moisture stains were fresh enough to matter. On the table he found a stainless steel thermos with scratches around the bottom but no heavy layer of dust. He unscrewed the lid and smelled weak tea. Cold now, but not ancient. Beside it lay a knitted burgundy scarf, one end hanging toward the floor. The mother German shepherd sniffed the scarf immediately and gave a quiet sound in her throat, not quite a whine. "Eleanor's?" Jason asked, though he knew the dog could not answer. A small plastic pill container lay beneath one of the chairs. The pharmacy label had partly peeled away, but the printed name was clear: Eleanor Brooks. Jason felt the search change shape in his mind. Until that moment they had been following possibilities. Now they had a confirmed location. Eleanor had reached this place. The question was no longer whether the dog was leading them somewhere connected to her. The question was why Eleanor had left again. Jason stepped outside and examined the clearing. There were impressions near the door, partly buried by new snow. One set looked human, but wind had rounded the edges until direction was difficult to determine. A faint track continued beyond the station toward the north side of the clearing, then disappeared beneath drifting powder. Jason radioed the coordinates to Sheriff Harris. Tom's response came through broken static. "Hold position. Search team is 25, maybe 30 minutes out. Weather's getting worse." Jason looked at the shepherd. She had moved to the edge of the clearing and was sniffing the ground, circling twice before returning to the station. "Understood," Jason answered. Every instinct in him wanted to continue before the trail vanished completely. But darkness was deepening, snow was increasing, and he had no confirmation which direction Eleanor had gone. Going alone simply because he hated waiting would not be courage. It would be ego wearing winter gear. Sheriff Harris arrived with 3 members of the county search team and Mark Brooks shortly afterward. Mark had insisted on coming as far as the vehicles could reach and had walked the final stretch behind them. Snow clung to his thinning dark blonde hair and the gray in his beard, and exhaustion had hardened the lines around his hazel eyes. The moment he saw the pill bottle, his face tightened. She was here. It was not a question. Tom Harris, steady as ever beneath a dark sheriff's winter cap, examined the floor and doorway while 2 search volunteers began marking the clearing. One of them, Deputy Rachel Moore, was a 34-year-old woman with a compact, athletic build, dark hair braided beneath a wool cap, and a calm, economical manner. She had grown up hunting with her father in the surrounding forests and had joined the sheriff's department partly because a cousin had once disappeared overnight during a January snowstorm. Rachel rarely dramatized danger. She respected it too much for that. She photographed the impressions outside and shook her head. "Snow's filling everything. We might get direction, not much more." Mark stared at the old station. "She walked all the way out here alone?" His voice rose. "At 78 in February?" Jason understood the anger now. It was fear searching for someone to blame. "Looks that way," he said. "Then this is exactly what I've been telling everyone. She shouldn't be living alone." Tom glanced at him but said nothing. Mark continued. "People keep talking about independence like it means pretending consequences don't exist." Jason almost agreed. He could imagine Eleanor slipping on ice, becoming disoriented, underestimating the cold. In his world, unnecessary risk was something competent people removed. Yet he remembered Claire's words from the kitchen. Removing every risk could remove the life along with it. Both ideas could be true at once, which was precisely what made ordinary life harder than missions. Missions usually gave a man an objective. Families gave him competing truths. While the others searched, Jason returned inside. His flashlight passed over the far wall and stopped on a crooked wooden frame, nearly hidden above a shelf. The photograph inside had faded to warm gray and brown. 5 young women stood outside the same station when its roof was straight and its logs still dark with fresh treatment. Their clothing placed the image decades earlier. heavy wool coats, flared trousers, knitted caps, practical winter boots. The woman in the center was perhaps in her early 30s, petite and fine-boned, with dark hair curling beneath a knit hat, and a determined expression that looked almost amused by the camera. Mark stepped behind Jason, his breath caught. "That's Eleanor." Jason looked at him. Mark pointed to the central woman. "My aunt." She would have been around 30 then. But Jason was no longer looking at Eleanor. The woman immediately beside her was much younger, perhaps 19, tall and slim, with thick, dark brown hair falling past her shoulders, light skin, a narrow straight nose, and serious gray-blue eyes that Jason had spent his entire childhood seeing reflected back at him across breakfast tables. Grace Miller had been softer-faced at 19 than he remembered her, but the slight tilt of her mouth was unmistakable. His mother. Jason lifted the frame from the wall with both hands. "Grace," he said. Mark frowned. "You know her?" Jason barely heard him. He remembered his mother as a woman in her 60s, practical and stubborn, a retired school office administrator who labeled freezer containers with dates and refused to throw away Christmas wrapping paper until it had survived at least 3 holidays. She had never mentioned this cabin, never mentioned Eleanor Brooks, never mentioned standing in the snow beside 4 women nearly 50 years earlier. "She was my mother." For several seconds, Mark said nothing. Outside, someone called that visibility was dropping. Tom entered and told them the team would have to suspend the wider search until first light, unless they found a reliable direction. Mark reacted immediately, but Tom cut him off. "Getting another person lost doesn't help Eleanor." Jason placed the photograph carefully on the table. He hated the decision, but he knew Tom was right. The German Shepherd, however, seemed unwilling to leave. She moved beneath the table, sniffed along the floor, then began scratching hard at one board. Jason knelt. "What is it?" The dog scratched again. One plank near the wall had a narrow gap along its edge, and far less dust than those around it. Jason worked a multi-tool beneath the board and lifted. Beneath the floor was a shallow cavity. Inside sat a rectangular metal box coated with rust, protected from moisture by an old piece of oilcloth. No one spoke as Jason pulled it into the light. Faded black lettering had been painted across the lid. Most of it remained readable. Winter, 1978. Below it in smaller letters, "For those who were never counted." Jason looked from the box to the photograph of his 19-year-old mother. Eleanor Brooks had disappeared into the winter after coming to this forgotten station, carrying a key that had somehow ended up on her German Shepherd's collar. Grace Miller had stood here almost half a century earlier. Whatever had brought Eleanor back was no longer merely the story of a missing woman. Somewhere inside this place was a part of his mother's life Jason had never known existed. And for the first time since entering the forest, he was afraid that finding Eleanor might also mean finding out why Grace had kept it secret. By the following morning, the storm had eased enough for Ironwood to begin digging itself out, though the sky remained low and gray, and the roads carried the dull, blue shine of packed snow. The search for Eleanor Brooks had resumed at first light, but Sheriff Harris had asked Jason not to return to the old mining station until the teams finished reassessing the surrounding trails. The metal box discovered beneath the floor had been photographed, logged, and checked for anything immediately useful to the search. When nothing inside appeared to indicate Eleanor's current location, Tom allowed Jason and Claire Wilson to examine the contents under the condition that anything relevant be reported at once. They worked at Claire's dining table because, as Claire dryly explained, history behaves better when given coffee and enough room to spread out. Her small brick house near downtown Ironwood was warm, crowded with books, and organized according to a system no visitor could understand, but Claire never questioned. Jason placed the box between them. Rust flaked from the corners when he lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of papers wrapped in cloth, several photographs, a thin ledger, envelopes tied with faded ribbon, and newspaper clippings browned at the edges. The smell was unmistakable. Old paper, dust, cold metal, and the faint sweetness of fabric that had spent decades shut away from light. Claire handled every page carefully, her 72-year-old fingers thin but steady. Years as a librarian had taught her that fragile documents could survive careless decades, only to be destroyed by one impatient person in 5 seconds. Jason, who had opened doors under far worse circumstances, found himself waiting for permission before touching anything. The first clipping was dated February 1978. Claire adjusted her round glasses and read silently before pushing it toward him. The headline described a severe winter storm that had shut highways, downed power lines, trapped motorists, and isolated farms throughout the western Upper Peninsula. Jason knew the storm existed. It belonged to the kind of local history people mentioned whenever younger residents complained about winter. What he had never heard was anything about the old mining station. Claire pulled 3 more articles from the box. They praised county crews, volunteer firefighters, snowplow operators, and men who used private trucks and snowmobiles to reach stranded residents. The stories were not false. People had been rescued, roads had been opened, lives had undoubtedly been saved. But then Claire opened the ledger. A page of handwritten names filled it, along with dates, food inventories, medical notes, and sleeping arrangements. At the top of one page, someone had written, North Station Emergency Shelter, February 6 through 15, 1978. There, Claire said. That's the part nobody put in the anniversary articles. Jason looked at her. Claire leaned back, studying the ceiling as if searching a shelf in her own memory. I was 24 that winter. I wasn't involved with this group, but everyone knew rumors. A few women were taking supplies out toward the old mining roads. People called it ladies helping neighbors. That phrase was enough to make it sound like casseroles and knitting. Her mouth tightened. People have always had interesting ways of making women's work disappear by describing it as kindness instead of labor. The ledger told a fuller story. Eleanor Brooks, then 30, had been a community nurse. Beside her name were lists of medications, basic first aid supplies, and notes about elderly residents who needed regular monitoring. Other entries referred to a school teacher who organized sleeping spaces, 2 widowed women who cooked over the station stove, mothers who brought blankets, and volunteers who moved supplies by sled when vehicles could no longer pass. No one seemed to have formally appointed them. They had simply seen a gap and filled it. The old mining station had heat, a working stove, a freshwater pump at the time, and enough floor space to shelter stranded people when the official warming center in town was full or unreachable. Claire counted more than 30 names across several days. Why wasn't this documented properly? Jason asked. It was, Claire replied, tapping the ledger. Just not by the people whose records became the official version. She did not sound bitter so much as unsurprised. History usually remembers whoever had a title, a uniform, a microphone, or a reason to write the report. That doesn't mean everyone else was absent. Jason looked down at the neat handwriting. He had spent most of his adult life wearing a uniform that made other people assume his actions mattered. He had never considered how many important things were done by people nobody thought to interview afterward. Then Claire stopped turning pages. Her finger rested beside one entry. Grace Miller, 19, arrived February 8th. Mild exposure, no serious injury. Jason felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. Beneath the line was a short notation. Found on County Road 14, no destination confirmed. Refuses family contact tonight. He read it twice. My mother told me she got caught in that storm, he said quietly. Once. She said she was young and stupid and took a ride when she shouldn't have. Claire looked at him over her glasses. That may have been true. That wasn't the whole story. No. They found more of it in a folded sheet written in Eleanor's hand. Grace had left home after an argument with her family. The document never explained the full dispute, only that the 19-year-old had packed a bag, accepted a ride north, and then found herself stranded when the storm closed the roads. She had no firm destination beyond the certainty that she did not want to go back immediately. Eleanor had apparently tried once to obtain a telephone number for Grace's parents. Grace refused. The next line was underlined. Give her tonight. Ask again tomorrow. Jason stared at those 5 words longer than anything else in the box. Give her tonight. His professional life had rarely rewarded waiting. When someone was injured, move. When a threat appeared, decide. When people froze under pressure, leadership meant making the decision for them before hesitation caused damage. Those instincts had become so deeply embedded that Jason sometimes treated uncertainty itself as an enemy. Eleanor, however, had been dealing with a frightened 19-year-old in a snowstorm and had apparently chosen not to force the next step. Claire opened another envelope. Jason. He recognized his mother's handwriting immediately. Grace had written the letter years after 1978. The paper was newer than the ledger but still old enough to have yellowed along the folds. Jason read slowly. Grace thanked Eleanor for food, dry clothes, and the place by the stove, but those were not what she remembered most. What she remembered was waking the morning after the storm, expecting to be told what to do. Eleanor had asked instead, "What do you want to happen next?" Grace wrote that nobody had asked her that during the argument she had fled. Everyone had been certain they knew what was best. Eleanor had been the first person to give her enough safety to think instead of simply react. One sentence made Jason set the page down. Grace wrote that she had eventually gone home, but she had done so because she chose to return, not because someone dragged her there. Jason pushed his chair back slightly. His first thought was unreasonable. Why had she never told him? The second was less comfortable. Perhaps she had tried in other ways. His mother had occasionally accused him, gently, of solving people before listening to them. Jason had always taken it as one of her jokes. Now it sounded less humorous. Claire watched him without interrupting. She should have called her parents, Jason finally said. Probably. She was 19. Yes. She could have died. Yes. Jason frowned. You agree with me too easily. Claire smiled faintly. You're looking for a clean argument. There isn't one. Grace was young and vulnerable. Eleanor had a responsibility to keep her safe. Grace also had a right to be treated like a person instead of a package that needed returning. Claire folded her hands. Both things can be true. Jason disliked that answer, because both things being true meant nobody could solve the problem simply by choosing the correct side. His phone vibrated. A message from Mark asked whether anything in the box identified where Eleanor might have gone after leaving the station. Jason answered honestly, not yet, still looking. They continued. Near the bottom lay a modern spiral notebook that clearly did not belong with the 1978 documents. Eleanor's handwriting was shakier than in the old ledger, but recognizable. Most pages contained ordinary notes, grocery lists, names, phone numbers, reminders about veterinary appointments and puppy feeding. Claire turned another page, then stopped. A date had been boxed in dark ink, February 24, retrieve final records before demolition survey. Below it, North Station property inspection next week. Do not leave original shelter files there. Jason sat straighter. Claire read the line again. That explains why she went. The old mining property was scheduled for a survey. The station, neglected for decades, might soon be demolished. Eleanor had not wandered into the forest confused or gone there on impulse. She had gone deliberately to retrieve the records before they could be lost. That answered one question. It made the remaining one worse. Jason looked at the notebook, then toward the window where snow slid quietly from Claire's roof. They already knew Eleanor had reached the station. They had found her medicine there. Her scarf, her tracks. They now knew exactly why she had gone. But the search teams had not found her inside, and the fresh snow had erased almost everything beyond the clearing. Jason closed the notebook. If Eleanor had gone into the forest to retrieve the records, and if she had accomplished what she came to do, then there was no reason for her not to return home. Unless something had happened after she left the station, and somewhere between that forgotten building and Ironwood, a 78-year-old woman was still missing. Night settled over Ironwood with the peculiar silence that follows a storm. when the wind weakens but the snow seems to absorb every sound the town makes. Jason Miller returned from Claire Wilson's house carrying Eleanor Brooks's recent notebook in his mind more heavily than any object in his hands. The search teams had already been told about the demolition survey note, and Sheriff Tom Harris planned to resume the search around the old mining station at first light. Jason should have slept. Instead, he sat at his mother's kitchen table watching the mother German Shepherd pace from the back door to the window and back again. The 2 7-week-old puppies had finally accepted the house as temporary shelter. The smaller female slept curled into the fold of an old wool blanket, paws twitching occasionally in some private puppy dream, while the heavier male lay on his stomach with his dark muzzle resting across Jason's boot. Their mother would not settle. She ignored the bowl of chicken Jason placed near her. She sniffed both puppies, walked to the door, stared outside, then returned to them. A few minutes later, she repeated the sequence. Jason had spent enough time around working dogs to recognize ordinary restlessness. This was different. "We went where you wanted," he said quietly. The shepherd looked at him, then toward the dark window. Jason heard his own sentence and frowned. No, he thought. They had gone where he had assumed she wanted. There was a difference. The first trail had ended at the old mining station because Jason had stopped there. The cabin contained Eleanor's things, her medicine, the photograph, the box. Human beings loved a convincing discovery. Give a person one meaningful clue and he could become dangerously willing to call it an answer. But the dog had never behaved as though the station was the end. Even when the search team arrived, she had circled the clearing, sniffed beyond the building, resisted leaving. Jason looked at her again. That wasn't it, was it? The shepherd moved to the door. At sunrise, the sky was pale and almost clear, but the temperature had dropped sharply. Sheriff Harris approved another attempt only after the search coordinator judged the winds manageable. Jason was paired with Owen Carter, a 38-year-old volunteer search and rescue technician who had spent 12 winters working the forests of Gogebic County. Owen was 5'10", compact and strong, with a square face reddened by cold, sandy brown hair cut short beneath a knit cap, and a trimmed reddish beard that made him look younger until one noticed the fine lines around his green eyes. He repaired power lines for a living and volunteered for winter rescue because his older brother had once spent a night lost after a snowmobile accident. Owen had found him alive the following morning, and the experience had permanently stripped adventure from his view of the woods. To Owen, winter wilderness was beautiful, in the same way deep water was beautiful, worthy of respect precisely because it did not care whether a person was good, loved, experienced, or afraid. Mark Brooks wanted to accompany them. "She's my aunt," he said when Tom refused. Mark's voice was controlled, but his shoulders were rigid beneath his coat. "And that's why you're staying here," Tom replied. "You're tired, angry, and you're not trained for this terrain." "Jason isn't local search and rescue either." Jason expected Tom to defend him. Instead, the sheriff said, "Jason follows instructions. Today that matters more." Mark's expression suggested he considered several answers and liked none of them. Claire stood nearby with a thermos clutched between both hands. She had volunteered to remain at the temporary coordination point with Mark and handle phone calls. "Arguing with Tom won't make Eleanor easier to find," she told Mark. "I'm not arguing." "You have been arguing for 6 minutes." Mark glared at her. "You seem very calm about this." Claire's face changed. "Do not confuse quiet with calm." That stopped him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mark looked toward the forest and admitted, 3 years ago, I found her on the kitchen floor." His voice had lost its edge. "She'd fallen beside the sink. She'd been there maybe 2 hours, maybe longer. She told me she was fine while I was calling the ambulance." Claire said nothing. "I keep seeing it," Mark continued. "Every time she doesn't answer the phone, I see that kitchen. I walk in, and this time she isn't talking." His eyes shone with anger because anger was easier to carry in public than terror. "So yes, I want her somewhere people can check on her. Is that really such a terrible thing?" Claire stepped closer.
Wanting her safe is not terrible. Deciding that your fear gives you ownership of every choice she makes is. Mark looked away. Claire softened.
You love her. But love can become a locked door if we aren't careful. Jason heard the exchange while adjusting his pack. He felt an uncomfortable recognition. Mark was doing emotionally what Jason had done professionally for most of his adult life. Identify danger, take control, remove options until the desired outcome remained. On missions, that could save people. In families, it could also make them feel managed instead of loved. The German Shepherd led Jason and Owen over the same abandoned mining road toward the old station. Her pace was faster than before, though she paused often enough to check them. When the cabin appeared between the trees, Jason expected her to approach the door. She did not. She curved around the rear wall without hesitation. Owen looked at Jason. Guess we stopped too soon yesterday. Looks that way. Behind the station, the ground dropped into a corridor where a service track had once run parallel to the old mining route. Snow had buried most of it, but the shepherd found the path easily. Perhaps Eleanor had walked it often enough that the scent remained familiar to her. 200 yards farther on, the dog stopped at a dark object protruding from the snow. Jason brushed it clean. A wooden walking cane. Mark had mentioned Eleanor used one outdoors on uneven ground. The handle bore a small strip of blue tape with the initials E.B. Owen marked the location and radioed it immediately. That changes priority, he said. She lost mobility support here. They continued more slowly. 50 yards beyond, Jason spotted a burgundy glove caught beneath the branch of a low spruce. It matched the scarf recovered from the station. The shepherd sniffed it once and moved on. Then Owen raised a hand. Wait! On the slope below the service road, the snow surface showed a broad disturbance partly filled by new powder. Something had slid downhill. Jason crouched. Near the upper edge was a shallow boot impression. Lower down, broken brush formed a line toward the base. She fell, Jason said. Owen nodded. Or slipped. Either way, she probably didn't climb back the same direction. The dog descended before either man could stop her. Jason followed carefully, angling across the slope rather than taking the direct line. At the bottom, they found fragments of an older maintenance path running toward the remains of a narrow-gauge mining railroad. Rusted rails occasionally emerged through snow like dark ribs. The shepherd accelerated. Jason's pulse began to rise. Not with excitement, he reminded himself, but urgency. The distinction mattered. People could become foolish when they sensed they were close to an answer. The trail curved behind a low ridge. There, half hidden among spruce, stood a small maintenance shed built from rough timber and corrugated metal. The front entrance had nearly vanished beneath a slab of snow that had slid from the roof. The German shepherd rushed to it and began digging. "Eleanor!" Jason shouted. He heard nothing. Owen shouted next. For several seconds, only the dog's claws scraped at snow. Then came a faint sound from inside, a knock, 3 times. Jason and Owen looked at each other. They began digging. The packed snow was heavier than it appeared. Owen used a collapsible shovel, while Jason cleared chunks away by hand, until enough of the doorframe was exposed to test it. It opened only a few inches before striking something inside. "Eleanor!" Jason called through the gap. A woman's voice answered, weak but unmistakably irritated. "If you break that door, somebody is going to have to fix it." Jason closed his eyes for half a second, alive. "We'll take the risk." They widened the opening enough for Jason to squeeze through. The shed was dim and brutally cold, but it had protected her from wind. Eleanor Brooks sat against the far wall, wrapped in an old canvas tarp and 2 dusty maintenance blankets. At 78, she was small and fine-boned, perhaps 5'3", with short silver-white hair flattened beneath a knitted cap, pale skin marked by age and cold, and blue-gray eyes that remained astonishingly sharp despite exhaustion. Her face was narrow, with deep lines around her mouth that suggested she had spent decades alternating between concern and dry amusement. One trouser leg had been loosened around a swollen ankle. A metal water bottle and an empty granola wrapper lay beside her. She looked fragile in the way winter makes almost every human being fragile, but there was nothing helpless in her expression. "You're Jason Miller," she said. Jason stared. "We can discuss that later." "That means yes." Then the shepherd squeezed through the opening behind him. Something in Eleanor's face finally broke. "Oh, sweetheart." The dog crossed the shed in 3 strides and pressed herself against Eleanor's chest. Eleanor wrapped both arms around her neck, burying one hand in the thick black and tan fur. The shepherd whined for the first time Jason had heard, low and trembling, then lay partly across Eleanor's legs as if physically preventing her from disappearing again. Eleanor whispered against her ear, "Where are your babies?" Jason crouched beside her. "Safe, at my house." Eleanor's eyes closed briefly. The relief in that small movement told him almost everything. "Power went out," she murmured. "I left them in the warmest room, thought I'd be back before dark." Jason checked her condition while Owen radioed their location. Eleanor's ankle appeared badly sprained, rather than obviously broken, and she was cold, dehydrated, and exhausted, but alert. Piece by piece, Jason understood what had happened. Eleanor had gone to the old station with the dog to retrieve the records. On the way back, she had taken the service trail, slipped down the slope, lost her cane and glove, then reached the maintenance shed but could not continue. The German shepherd had remained with her at first. Then, instinct had forced an impossible choice. Her owner was stranded. Her puppies were alone in a house losing heat. She had gone back to them. When Eleanor's home grew too cold, the dog had taken the puppies to the nearest occupied house she could find, the one whose lights showed through the snow. Jason's house. And once she decided the puppies were safe there, she had tried repeatedly to lead him back. There was no magic in it. Jason found the truth more moving because there was no magic. A frightened mother had solved what she could with scent, memory, instinct, and a reluctant decision to trust a stranger. Outside, rescue voices approached. Eleanor opened her eyes and studied Jason's face more carefully. "You look like Grace around the eyes," she said. Jason became still. Owen entered with the medical team behind him, but Eleanor continued watching Jason. "You knew my mother." Eleanor gave the faintest smile. Then, as the rescuers prepared to move her onto a stretcher, she reached out and caught Jason by the sleeve. "Tell me something first." Jason leaned closer. Eleanor's blue-gray eyes remained fixed on his. "Did you find your mother's box?" 3 days after Eleanor Brooks was carried out of the maintenance shed, the swelling in her ankle had begun to ease, and the color had returned to her face. She remained at the small hospital in Ironwood for observation. Not because she enjoyed being there. She had already complained twice about the coffee and once about the indignity of hospital gowns, but because dehydration, exposure, and a badly sprained ankle were less forgiving at 78 than they had been at 30. Jason Miller visited in the late afternoon, bringing the only thing Eleanor had asked for besides real coffee, the old photograph from the mining station. Eleanor sat upright beside the window, her short silver-white hair combed back into place, blue-gray eyes as alert as they had been when Jason first found her beneath 2 dusty blankets. Mark Brooks occupied the chair nearest the bed, broad shoulders hunched forward, his gray-streaked beard making him look more tired than angry for once. Claire Wilson sat on the opposite side with a folder of copied documents on her lap. The atmosphere was civil in the fragile way a frozen lake could look solid while still warning anyone sensible not to jump. Jason placed the photograph on Eleanor's blanket. "You asked if I found my mother's box." Eleanor studied Grace Miller's 19-year-old face for several seconds before answering. "I should have said our box. Your mother put as much into that place as I eventually did." Jason frowned. "The records make it sound like Grace was there for a week in 1978. "The first time,"
Eleanor looked at him. She came back. That was how Jason learned the old mining station had survived long after the famous storm. The emergency shelter in February 1978 had begun as improvisation. Too many stranded people, not enough beds in town, roads nobody could reach reliably. After the weather cleared, most residents forgot the station existed.
Eleanor and several of the women who had worked there did not. They had seen something during those 10 days that official reports never quite captured. Some people needed more than extraction from a snowdrift. They needed a place where their trouble did not have to become public property. A widow whose furnace failed might stay one night until repairs were arranged. A mother with 2 children might stay 3 days because heating fuel had run out before payday. An older farmer recovering from pneumonia might sleep there during a power outage rather than risk freezing alone. Sometimes a person arrived with no physical emergency at all, only a face that made Eleanor ask no questions until morning. "We started calling it the Quiet House," Eleanor said. "Not because it was actually quiet, Lord, no. Put 6 women, 3 children, a kettle, and 1 unreliable stove in a room, and you'll hear plenty. It was quiet because nobody had to explain themselves the moment they walked through the door." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "You were running an unofficial shelter in the woods?" Eleanor gave him a look. "For years. And nobody knew?" Claire answered before Eleanor could. "Some people knew. Apparently the correct people." Mark's jaw tightened. "That sounds clever until someone gets hurt." Eleanor's gaze hardened. "People were already hurt, Mark. That was usually why they came." Jason asked about Grace. Eleanor's expression softened. After the storm, Grace had returned home by her own choice, repaired what she could with her family, and eventually built the life Jason remembered. But she had not forgotten the station. In her 20s, she returned during winter weekends to bring supplies. Later, she helped organize clothing donations and quietly drove people there when they needed somewhere warm but were too proud to ask the county for assistance. Once, she spent 2 nights with an elderly woman whose electricity had been disconnected after a billing dispute. Another time, she brought a young mother and infant to the station during a heating failure and stayed until morning because the woman was frightened to sleep alone. "Your mother could be stubborn enough to argue with weather," Eleanor said. "I assume you inherited that." Jason almost smiled. "People usually say worse. Give me time." But the humor did not remove the sting beneath his ribs. Grace had been dead 8 months. Jason had believed he knew the shape of her life. School office administrator, widow, practical mother who folded grocery bags and saved rubber bands in a kitchen drawer. He had known the ordinary facts, and somehow missed an entire hidden architecture of choices. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question rather than protecting him with a quick answer. "Maybe because it wasn't hers to tell." Jason looked at her. "Some of those people came to us because they had nowhere else. Some came because they couldn't afford heat, some because they were ashamed of needing help, some because home was complicated for a few days." Eleanor touched the photograph. "Grace understood that knowing someone's worst week does not make you the owner of it." Mark leaned forward. "And now the building is about to be torn down." His practical mind had already moved toward action. "Then we stop it." Eleanor's eyes moved to him. "How?" "We tell people what happened there, the newspaper, local television if we need it. There are 30 names in that ledger, maybe more. We show the town what the place meant and put pressure on the developer." Jason immediately saw the logic. Public attention created leverage. Leverage created delay. Delay created options. It was a method he understood. "He may be right," Jason said. "If the county sees the historical value, no." Eleanor's answer was quiet enough to make both men stop. Mark stared at her. "No? You want to save the building by publishing the names of people who went there because they trusted us not to make their lives public? We don't have to publish everything. Who decides what is acceptable?" Mark gestured toward the folder. "Some of these people are dead." "Their children aren't." Eleanor's voice sharpened. Their grandchildren aren't. And even if every person in those books were gone, their dignity did not expire with them. Mark pushed himself from the chair and walked toward the window, frustration visible in the rigid line of his back. So we do nothing because someone 40 years ago might be embarrassed. That is not what I said. Then what are you saying? I am saying their stories are not ammunition. The sentence stayed in the room. Jason felt it land harder than Mark did. Ammunition. He had spent years learning to use information because information was advantage. Know where something was hidden, who wanted what pressure could move someone, what fact could change a decision. The habit was not cruel. In his profession, it had often been necessary. But Eleanor was asking him to see a boundary he rarely needed to consider in the field. He had found the records. That did not mean the records belonged to him. He had discovered part of Grace's past. That did not mean every private life touching hers had suddenly become material for his purpose. Then how do we prove the station mattered? Jason asked. Eleanor looked at him with something almost approving. It was the first question he had asked that did not begin with an answer already hidden inside it. Without exposing people who trusted us, she said. That is the harder version, yes. Claire opened the folder on her lap. Maybe not impossible. For the past 2 days, she had been searching county archives, old property transfers, mining company records, and municipal meeting minutes. Retirement had apparently only removed the salary from her work, not the instinct. I found references to the shelter without individual names, supply reimbursements, a county health note, a volunteer fuel authorization, enough to establish community use without turning anybody's private history into a newspaper feature. Mark turned from the window. Some of the fight had drained from him. Would that be enough? Claire raised one shoulder. Possibly. I kept digging. She removed a photocopy from the bottom of the folder. The original document dated to 1979, when ownership of several abandoned mining parcels had been reorganized. A clause buried beneath legal language stated that before demolition or material alteration of a structure documented as having served an ongoing public or emergency community function, the county board had to allow a review of preservation alternatives or replacement of that community function. It was not a guarantee. It did not declare the station untouchable. But it created something Jason understood immediately. Time. A hearing, an opening. That's our leverage, Mark said. Eleanor's mouth tightened at the word. Jason noticed. Our opportunity, he corrected. Eleanor looked at him. Better. Claire tapped the document. The demolition survey can proceed, but this should prevent anyone from simply tearing the station down before the board considers its documented use. Mark sat again, already thinking aloud. We could raise money, local donors, veterans groups, historical society, repair the roof, reinforce the foundation, clear an access road. Jason's mind accelerated with his. Get an engineer out there, build a budget. I know people who could help coordinate. For the first time since Eleanor had been rescued, Jason felt the satisfying clarity of a problem becoming a mission. There was a building. It mattered. It was threatened. Save it. The objective was almost beautifully simple. By the following afternoon, Jason had 3 pages of notes. He returned to Eleanor's room with repair estimates he had begun requesting, names of potential volunteers, and a rough idea for a fundraising campaign. Mark had offered contacts through his building supply company. Claire had agreed to preserve the historical records. Even Sheriff Harris had said the project sounded worthwhile, provided nobody expected him to climb onto the roof. Jason laid the pages across Eleanor's bedside table with a confidence he had not felt in weeks. We can do this without using the private names, he said. Structural inspection first, then emergency stabilization. Mark can source materials at cost. We document the public service history, apply for local preservation money, and build a volunteer group. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Jason mistook that for encouragement.
If we move fast enough, the county may delay the development agreement. The building stays.
The records stay connected to the place. Quiet House survives. Eleanor looked down at his careful notes. Then she looked back at him. "What?" Jason asked. "You found a thing that can be saved," she said, "and now you are happy again." He frowned. "I thought that was the point." "No." Eleanor's voice was gentle, which somehow made the words worse. "Jason, you have spent your whole life learning how to pull people out of burning rooms. It has made you very good at seeing the room." He waited. "But sometimes," Eleanor continued, "the room is not what mattered." Jason glanced at the preservation plan. "You don't want to save the station?" Eleanor settled back against her pillow and studied him with those sharp, blue-gray eyes. "I think," she said, "you are about to save the wrong thing again." By the time Eleanor Brooks left the hospital, Jason Miller had already drawn 3 versions of a preservation plan for the old mining station. He had measurements, rough material estimates, names of people who could inspect the roof, and a list Mark Brooks had prepared of suppliers willing to donate lumber at cost. It was exactly the kind of work Jason understood. Identify what was failing, reinforce the weak points, establish resources, assign responsibility, move. The plans sat in a neat folder on Eleanor's kitchen table when she returned home on crutches, her injured ankle supported by a rigid brace, and her patience considerably less supported by anything. Mark had cleared the front steps, installed a temporary rail, and moved a chair near the entryway before she arrived. Eleanor noticed all 3 things. She thanked him for 2. "Which one did I do wrong?" Mark asked. Eleanor pointed at the chair. "If I start sitting down every time I enter my own house, I'll never get anything done." Mark opened his mouth, then shut it again. Jason saw the effort. A week earlier, Mark would have argued. Now he only moved the chair 6 feet away. Small changes, Jason thought, rarely arrived with music behind them. Most looked like someone deciding not to say the next sentence. Eleanor read Jason's preservation proposal after lunch. She turned each page carefully, pausing over the estimate for roof reinforcement, foundation repair, winter access, and electrical work. Jason waited for approval. Instead, Eleanor removed her glasses. "How much?" "Initial stabilization? Probably 40,000 if we get donated labor. Full restoration, significantly more." "And after spending significantly more, how does Mrs. Donnelly get there when her furnace breaks in January?" Jason frowned. "Who's Mrs. Donnelly?" "She doesn't exist. That is the point." Eleanor pushed the papers toward him. "Imagine she is 82, uses a walker and lives in town. Or imagine a mother with a toddler whose apartment loses heat. Or a man whose electricity is shut off and who is too embarrassed to tell his children. You want to preserve Quiet House. How do they reach it?" Jason looked at the map. The station lay nearly an hour into the woods on foot under winter conditions. Even with an access road restored, regular plowing and maintenance would be expensive. "We could improve the road." "So first we save a collapsing building, then we build a road to the collapsing building, then we maintain the road so people in trouble can drive away from town into the forest to receive help." Eleanor leaned back. "Jason, that is not preservation. That is nostalgia with a construction budget." Mark coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Jason gave him a look. "You were helping me price lumber yesterday." "I contain multitudes." "You contain bad timing." Eleanor's mouth twitched. Then she became serious. "The old station mattered because it served people when people needed it. If we spend all our energy preserving the object after it stops serving them, we have confused the container for the purpose." Jason looked toward the window. Maggie, finally reunited with Eleanor and visibly calmer, lay on a rug near the radiator. The 4-year-old German shepherd had gained a little weight during the previous week, though nursing 2 puppies had left her still narrow through the flanks. Her torn ear twitched whenever someone raised a voice. Lucy, the smaller female puppy, was asleep against Maggie's forelegs, while Ben, heavier and more cautious,
had discovered that Mark's bootlaces were apparently worth a prolonged investigation. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic enough for the amount of thinking it caused. Eleanor had an alternative.
On Maple Street, 3 blocks from downtown Ironwood, stood an unused neighborhood community building the county had closed 2 years earlier after consolidating programs elsewhere. The structure was plain: brick exterior, 1 large multi-purpose room, a small kitchen, 2 restrooms, storage, and, most importantly, street access that could actually be plowed. Eleanor wanted the county to allow a volunteer organization to reopen it during severe winter conditions. Backup heat, a generator, several folding cots, hot meals, a phone tree for elderly residents. A place where someone could come for a night without first proving their life had become sufficiently miserable to deserve warmth. That, Eleanor said, would be Quiet House. Jason glanced at his preservation folder. And the station? Document it properly. Save the old sign if it can be removed without destroying it. Take a few sound timbers. Preserve the photographs and the records people have given permission to preserve publicly. Let the dangerous parts come down. Jason disliked the phrase, come down. It sounded too much like surrender. The county hearing took place 4 days later. The meeting room smelled faintly of coffee, wet coats, and carpet that had survived several administrations. County Board Chair Margaret Hale presided from the center desk. Margaret was 63, broad-faced and silver-haired, with a sturdy build, dark green reading glasses, and the measured voice of a retired high school principal who had spent decades refusing to be intimidated by louder people. She had grown up in Ironwood, knew enough local families to understand how quickly public history could become private injury, and had a habit of folding her hands before asking the question everyone else had been avoiding. A structural engineer's report was blunt. The mining station's roof framing was compromised. Portions of the foundation had shifted, and safe public access would require major reconstruction. Historical value was undeniable. Practical usefulness in its present location was nearly non-existent. Jason presented first. Months earlier, he would have argued for saving the entire station. Instead, he described its documented emergency use, the newly discovered records, and Eleanor's proposal to preserve only historically significant components while transferring the function into town. He spoke without naming anyone who had once sought shelter there. When one board member asked for dramatic examples of people Quiet House had helped, Jason paused. The old version of himself would have answered because examples persuaded people. There are stories in the records that could make this proposal easier to sell, he said. Eleanor watched him from the audience. But they belong to the people who lived them. We can demonstrate the station's value without spending their privacy. Margaret Hale nodded once and wrote something down. Mark spoke next. His contribution surprised Eleanor most. He outlined practical changes needed at her home. Improved railings, automatic emergency lighting, a generator connection, better exterior traction, and scheduled check-ins during severe weather. Then he added, "These are things my aunt has agreed to. I want that entered correctly because I spent too long treating what frightened me as if it automatically gave me authority." Eleanor did not smile, but she reached over and touched Claire's hand. During a recess, Jason stepped into the hallway and found another message from his commanding officer waiting on his phone. The training position needed an answer. He had delayed it for weeks, telling himself he required more information, more time, one more sign that staying in operational work was still the right choice. Now he recognized the behavior with almost embarrassing clarity. He had been doing exactly what he first tried to do with the mining station, keeping an old structure standing because it contained a version of himself he was afraid to lose. He called. The conversation lasted less than 6 minutes. "Yes," Jason said finally. "I'll take the training assignment." When the call ended, he did not feel younger, older, defeated, or transformed. He simply stood in a county hallway beside a vending machine that hummed too loudly and realized one chapter of his career could change shape without becoming worthless. Experience did not have to disappear merely because it stopped wearing the same uniform in the same way. Claire found him there. Good news? Different news. That sounds suspiciously mature. Don't spread it around. Back inside, the board reconvened. Margaret Hale read the decision carefully. The county would formally recognize the Old North Station's documented community role. Safe architectural elements, photographs, the surviving sign, and approved historical materials would be preserved. The structure itself would not be restored for public occupation because of cost, location, and safety concerns. Most of it would eventually be dismantled under supervised conditions. In exchange, the board approved a pilot agreement allowing the Maple Street Community Building to be reopened as a winter emergency support space, pending final inspection and volunteer funding. Nobody cheered immediately. Jason was glad they didn't. The decision contained both preservation and loss. It deserved a little silence. Outside the building, snow had begun falling again in soft, slow flakes. Mark helped Eleanor down the steps, but waited for her to choose where to place her crutch before offering an arm. Jason noticed that too. Claire walked ahead, carrying the folder of approved documents beneath her coat. Jason stopped beside Eleanor. "I thought you'd be happier," she said. "I'm thinking about the station. So am I. A lot of it will be gone." "Yes." Jason looked toward the dark line of woods beyond town. He could picture the old building exactly. Sagging roof, battered door, Grace's photograph on the wall, the floorboard hiding the box for almost half a century. "Doesn't that bother you?" Eleanor studied him for a moment, then looked at the snow gathering on the courthouse railing. "Jason, when your mother arrived there at 19, she was cold, frightened, and angry. The roof didn't ask her what she wanted to do next. I did. The stove didn't drive her home when she chose to return. Someone did. The floorboards didn't bring food to families years later. Your mother did." Jason said nothing. Eleanor adjusted the crutch beneath her arm. "Wood never saved your mother, Jason. People did." He looked back once at the folder in Claire's hands, then toward Eleanor, Mark, and the street where a different building would soon carry an old purpose into a new winter. For most of his life, Jason had believed respect meant refusing to abandon something valuable. Only now did he begin to understand that sometimes respect meant allowing the form to disappear, while making certain the reason it existed did not. By early summer, the old community building on Maple Street had stopped looking abandoned. The brick walls were still plain, the linoleum floor still showed pale rectangles where furniture had once stood, and nobody had bothered pretending the place was beautiful. That was one of the things Eleanor Brooks liked about it. "People who are cold do not need decorative molding," she told Mark the afternoon he suggested replacing the trim around the front windows. "They need heat." Mark, now wise enough to recognize when an argument had already been lost, spent the money on an additional emergency battery instead. The Quiet House community room officially opened with no ribbon cutting and no newspaper photographer. Eleanor had insisted on both conditions. Inside were several folding cots, shelves of clean blankets, a small pantry stocked with soup, oatmeal, coffee, tea, and shelf-stable meals, a backup generator, a simple kitchenette, and a phone list of older residents who had agreed to receive check-in calls during severe weather. Claire Wilson took possession of one wall and turned it into a modest library. She claimed people facing a long winter night deserved something better to read than emergency instructions. The shelves held mysteries, westerns, romances, large print novels, local history, and several gardening books that Claire admitted were mostly there to remind everyone that winter eventually lost. Above the books hung the old weathered sign salvaged from the mining station. Nothing about the room announced heroism. Nobody entering had to explain why the furnace had failed, why the utility bill had become impossible, why family was unavailable, or why being alone that night simply felt too heavy. Eleanor said that was how she knew they had preserved the correct part. Eleanor herself returned to her own house after agreeing to changes she would once have resisted on principle. Mark installed sturdier railings, emergency lighting,
a generator connection, and a medical alert system. A home aide came several days each week, though Eleanor spent the first month complaining that the woman reorganized kitchen towels with dangerous enthusiasm. The important difference was that Eleanor had agreed to every arrangement herself. Mark still worried. He still called too often when weather warnings appeared. He still had a tendency to begin sentences with, "I think you should," but he had learned to stop and ask, "What do you think?" before finishing them. Eleanor, for her part, discovered that accepting help did not automatically surrender authority. Neither change came gracefully. Progress rarely did. They still irritated one another. Neither change came gracefully. Occasionally ended phone calls earlier than politeness recommended. Yet their arguments no longer revolved around whether Eleanor was allowed to make decisions. They revolved around ordinary family subjects like thermostat settings, grocery quantities, and whether Mark truly needed to salt a walkway that had already been salted twice. The German Shepherd finally had her name spoken openly whenever Jason visited: Maggie. She had belonged to Eleanor for nearly 4 years, and after recovering from the strain of nursing and the days spent running between the forest and town, her black and tan coat regained its healthy shine. The slight tear in one ear remained, giving her otherwise dignified face a permanent hint of mischief. She lived with Eleanor again, usually occupying a rug near the kitchen where she could watch both the front door and whoever happened to be cooking. Lucy and Ben grew quickly. Lucy remained smaller, bright-eyed, impatient, and convinced every new object had been placed on Earth for her personal investigation. Ben developed into a heavier young German Shepherd with oversized paws and a habit of standing several feet back before deciding whether something deserved his trust. Jason spent enough time in Ironwood between training obligations that the puppies often stayed with him, especially when Eleanor had appointments or needed a quieter day. They were never separated from Maggie for dramatic effect or turned into symbols of sacrifice. They simply moved between two homes where they were known. Maggie corrected Lucy when she became rude, tolerated Ben climbing over her longer than dignity allowed, and occasionally looked at Jason with the same measuring brown eyes she had worn on his porch. He liked to think she trusted him now. He was also honest enough to admit she might simply have concluded he was useful. Jason's new training assignment began that summer. The first weeks were more difficult than he expected, not because he disliked teaching, but because he discovered how deeply he had tied usefulness to proximity to danger. He could explain judgment, planning, restraint, communication, and the mistakes that only experience taught. Yet some mornings he watched younger SEALs prepare for work he once would have considered his without question, and felt a quiet ache beneath the ribs. On those days he wondered whether he had moved aside too soon. He never told himself the doubt was foolish. That was another thing Ironwood had changed. He no longer believed uncertainty automatically meant a decision was wrong. Sometimes uncertainty was simply the price of choosing one life while knowing another life remained possible. What surprised him most was how often the younger men needed him not to demonstrate action, but to explain when action should stop. Jason had once believed leadership was most visible in the moment someone moved first. Increasingly, he understood that leadership could also be the person who said, "Not yet. We don't know enough." Grace would have enjoyed that irony. By autumn, the old mining station had been carefully documented. The safest timbers were removed, the old sign preserved, and portions of the structure dismantled before winter could finish the work without permission. Jason visited once during the process. He expected grief and found something quieter. The clearing looked larger without the sagging roof. For several minutes he stood where Grace Miller had once stood at 19, frightened, angry, unsure whether to return home. Jason thought about the years he had spent believing his mother's life was something he understood because he knew her routines, her habits, her recipes, the names of her friends. People were always larger than the version even their children carried. That realization no longer felt like betrayal. It felt almost like another gift. Grace had been his mother,
But she had also been a 19-year-old girl in a storm. A volunteer carrying blankets through snow, a woman who had chosen not to make someone else's private pain into conversation. Jason could miss her without pretending he had ever possessed all of her. When winter returned to Ironwood, it came heavily. Snow covered Maple Street, the trees bent beneath white weight, and the temperature fell low enough for the Quiet House phone list to become useful rather than ceremonial. Jason arrived during a visit in late afternoon and found the community room already occupied. An elderly couple sat near the heater sharing a crossword puzzle. A middle-aged man whose furnace repair had been delayed drank soup at a folding table. Claire stood beside the coffee maker wearing an expression of personal betrayal. "This is terrible," she announced when Jason entered. "It has somehow become worse." Jason poured himself a cup.
"Maybe that's our tradition." "Suffering is not tradition."
Eleanor sat near the window, with Maggie stretched beneath her chair. Her silver-white hair was neatly combed, and though she still used a cane on icy days, she looked stronger than she had in the maintenance shed. Lucy and Ben lay beside their mother, nearly grown now, 3 black and tan bodies forming a loose pile of paws and tails. Mark was across the room checking the generator panel. He looked over at Eleanor before touching anything and asked, "You want the room another degree warmer?" Eleanor considered it. 1. Mark adjusted it 1 degree. Jason smiled. Snow thickened outside until the streetlights became soft circles behind the glass. Jason took a chair near Eleanor. For a while, neither spoke. Maggie slept so deeply that one paw twitched. Lucy rested with her head across Maggie's back. Ben had curled himself near Jason's boot, a habit he had never completely outgrown. Then Jason looked toward the window. It happened without thought. His eyes searched the dark glass, and some part of him waited for 3 familiar scratches. Nothing came. No thin mother dog stood outside covered in snow. No puppies huddled beneath her. No animal looked toward the forest asking a stranger to understand something he had not yet learned how to see. Eleanor noticed. "Do you miss it?" she asked. Jason looked at her. "What?" "The knocking." He understood. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, someone laughed softly at the crossword table. Claire complained about coffee. Mark carried another blanket toward the shelves. 3 German shepherds slept without watching the door. Jason shook his head. "No," he said. "I think the best part is that she doesn't have to knock anymore." Near the entrance hung the small brass key that had once rested against Maggie's collar. It no longer opened the old station. The lock it belonged to was gone with most of the building. Beneath the key was a simple plaque Eleanor had approved only after rejecting 3 versions for sounding too sentimental. It read, "If winter has left you without a warm place to go, come inside. You do not have to explain first." Jason looked at it for a long moment. He had not become a different man. He still liked answers. Mark still worried. Eleanor still disliked being helped before she had asked. Claire still considered weak coffee a moral failure. Maggie was not magical and had never known the meaning of an old photograph or a forgotten ledger. She had only been a mother trying to protect 2 puppies while finding her way back to someone she trusted. Maybe that was why the story mattered. Nothing had been made perfect. It had simply been made possible. The old building was gone. The reason for it remained, and on a winter evening in Ironwood, with the door unlocked and the lights burning warm against the snow, that was enough. Sometimes the miracle is not that God keeps every old door standing. Sometimes the miracle is that He shows us what was worth carrying forward when the door is gone. Jason wanted to save a building. Mark wanted to protect Eleanor by controlling every risk. Eleanor wanted to remain independent without admitting every weakness. And Maggie simply did what love often does best. She kept searching for a safe place until someone finally paid attention. There is a lesson in that for all of us. Love is not always fixing someone. It is not always holding tighter, deciding faster, or refusing to let anything change. Sometimes love means listening before acting, helping without taking away dignity, and accepting that people we care about may choose differently than we would. Perhaps God's grace often works that quietly, not by restoring everything exactly as it was, but by giving old love a new place to live. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need its message today. Tell us in the comments what the story meant to you, and subscribe for more stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep a warm door open whenever life brings another winter.